Shall we get started?
Hello everybody, welcome to our sixth and final lecture in our 2024 lecture series Design for Change. Today presenting is Jean-François Lemay and will be presenting the lecture for us today. Thank you for coming and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you very much. We're recording. Good to go? All right. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to Jasmine, Farisa, Kofi, and Jonathan, and Arjun of the RUAS. This year's lecture, as you know, the topic is change. And since I gave a lecture last year, perhaps the most important thing for me was to give a different lecture, which was the main meaning of the word change when I started thinking about this lecture. It has to be new content. I wouldn't want to bore the audience. But what is a lecture on change? It could be all kinds of things, right? The first thing that came to my mind is that maybe it ought to be about climate change or those sorts of things. There are some obvious associations with the word change, and perhaps the previous lectures have covered these associations. But this evening, for the final lecture, I hope to present you a different perspective on change. Maybe this is sometimes what we think of when we talk about change, right? Some loose change, more than loose change in this case. I want to talk to you about a bigger form of change, universal change or cosmic change, whatever is happening around us. Essentially, I want to talk to you about the universal direction of change. And let me elaborate on that. What is the direction in which things happen in the universe generally? If I have a glass and I drop it, it's going to fall to the floor. And generally these processes are, well, shall I say, they all happen and they all tend towards one goal, which is to have the lowest possible potential, which is why, well, the glass falls to the floor. And what causes these changes? They're caused by forces. As you may have covered in your physics classes, there are four fundamental forces in the universe: gravity, electromagnetism, strong nuclear, and weak nuclear. And all of them tend towards the minimum total potential energy all the time. This is why you expect things to fall towards a heavy object and not run away from it, for instance. So it all tends toward the lowest potential. What is potential? What do we mean by potential? It's possible to illustrate it in ways that make it more palatable to us humans, because we're just kind of trying to understand the universe that we live in. This is high potential. Here's a wallet, there's cash in it, for those places that still accept cash, right? With this, I can go and do something. So I've got high potential. And once it's spent, especially if I've spent it on something that's non-refundable, like a dinner, for instance, it's not going to come back, right? Unless I earn it again. But I'm not going to get my money back from the dinner. I've consumed it. It's spent, right? So I've gone from high potential to low potential. Here's another example. This is the top of a mountain in the Alps. There's lots of rocks at the top. And over the years, they're going to roll down the hill with the rain and with the wind and with erosion. And they're going to go from this position of very high potential to the bottom of the valley, where they're now in a position of low potential. And unless some external thing happens, they're going to stay there, right? There's no expectation that they're just going to change in the other direction and go back on top of the mountain. Unless, of course, there's some tectonic thing happening. But like, generally speaking, it goes from high to low in the universe. Not in terms of height, but in terms of potential. But you can also look at it in kind of slightly more philosophical things, you know. here I've got two things that are separate. So something could happen. I've got the milk and I've got the tea. I've got potential to make something happen. I start pouring it. We're all very familiar with this. We go from order, a certain type of order which had a lot of potential, separate tea and milk. And now they're mixing and there's chaos and all kinds of things are being released. I mean, all kinds of actions are happening. Change is happening. But the change is going in a direction towards a new form of order where now I've got the tea and the milk mixed, and that's kind of where it ends, right? There's no expectation that I could just decide to take the tea out of the milk. It was so easy to put in the milk, to put the milk in the tea. And getting the milk out of the tea is basically impossible. And no one in their right mind would expect that at some point the milk is just going to come out as easily as it went in. That doesn't happen in the universe. So potential is stored readiness for change. Essentially, you can imagine it this way. I've got a ball at the top of the hill. If I give it a push, it's going to go towards the bottom of the valley, and it's going to stay there. So here I've got potential. It's going to go down. Actually, a lot of the time in the universe, things are just kind of in a state of high potential, but they're kind of semi-stable there because they're caught in a kind of hump. And if you give it a little push, you're going to get a lot more than you put in, right? You just give it a little kick, and then suddenly it goes right down the mountain, and you get a big release of energy, which was the potential that was in it. What's the probability that the money will return to the wallet, that the rock will ascend the mountain, or that the milk will unmix with the tea? It's none. Because as I've just said, it goes from higher to lower potential. This is the normal direction of change. So let's look at the sun, the main protagonist in change in our neighborhood, I would say. This, incidentally, is the highest resolution photograph of the sun ever taken by the European Space Agency and NASA Solar Orbiter in 2022. It's quite fascinating to get this new perspective on our star. I won't bore you with what's happening, but I just want to give you a quick overview of what's happening in a normal star. You have hydrogen, which is essentially one proton. And there's a lot of gravity, and it just crushes it, and it turns it into helium. Two of the protons become neutrons, and you get helium with two protons, two neutrons. But when you do that, you've released energy, right? So there was a hump to go over. The gravity and all kinds of heat pushed you over the hump, and you've released energy. So you went from high potential to low potential. Helium has less potential than hydrogen, which is the normal change, right? And this thing, which is called the main sequence, is going to continue like this, protons getting over the hump, helium, etc. At some point, you're going to have a lot of helium. The helium is going to combine, becomes beryllium, carbon, oxygen, neon, magnesium. It continues, right? But the thing is, every time you go to a bigger element, you're still releasing potential, you're still releasing energy when you fuse them, but it gets less and less interesting until you reach 26 protons, which is iron. And iron, as it turns out, along with other elements that are nearby, have nothing left to give, right? So if you take iron and you try to fuse it with some other iron, it doesn't work because there's no energy left to be released. So it's one of those elements, if you split it, like with fission, you get nothing. And if you fuse it, you get nothing. You've reached the bottom of the valley with iron. And you can kind of see it here, that the binding energy is highest for iron, and then after that you still, the hill goes down a little bit towards things like uranium, which means you can get something by splitting uranium. But if you split iron, you get nothing. Essentially, this is the valley upside down, Iron is the bottom of the valley. So there it is, iron. So it seems that in the universe, it's all spend, 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 right? The sun is just burning through its fuel with no kind of like idea of keeping some of it, It's just going to burn all of it. And then it's going to become cold, dark, and iron. And that's what's going to happen in the universe. Essentially, if you run it for a very long time, it's all going to become, at least according to current theories, it's all going to become very bleak. So here's a picture of Mars. If I said to you, if I ask you, what's the probability that any one of these rocks is going to end up on top of that mountain over there? What would you say? Yeah, none, right? Even though they're getting sunshine, there's lots of energy falling on them. Nothing is happening. They're kind of at minimum potential right now. There's no way for them to use the sunshine that's falling on them. So they may have been there for 1 million years, for all we know, right? Nothing is happening. They've reached the bottom of the valley. But here's some other rocks in England, and they're standing up. And some of them are 100 tons in weight. How is that possible, right? How is it possible? We've just said that rocks on Mars have been sitting there and nothing happens. Nothing is going to happen. They've reached a minimum potential. How come these rocks went from being in a state of low potential to high potential? Because they could fall, right? If I kick, it's going to fall, so that means it has potential. It's some kind of a miracle, right? What's going on? The answer, of course, is life, right? We all know this. The point I'm trying to make to you today is that the difference between life and non-life, right? When you put in life in the equation, somehow it goes in the opposite direction of everything else in the universe. So suddenly, not only do stones start standing up, but they travel. These stones have come, the biggest ones have traveled 32 kilometers. Can you imagine carrying them? What on earth would justify, what in the universe would justify this, And the smaller ones have traveled 230 kilometers. It's just absolutely ridiculous that something like that would happen. Not ridiculous, more incomprehensible, right? Until, if nobody knew about life, if you were just a dead computer coming to Earth and you saw this, you wouldn't be able to explain it. You'd say, how come these stones have just stood up? So life causes stones to climb mountains. It causes potential energy to rise. The wallet fills with money. The milk comes out of the tea. It really causes mountains to rise, right? Not through tectonic forces, but I mean in a place where nothing was supposed to happen, a mountain came out of the ground. And not with the rocks that were there, but with rocks that were taken up the river hundreds of kilometers away. In the construction of the pyramids, for instance. So we could ask what's the meaning of life, but that's a big question and we're not going to make it. So I would say, what's most important for life? I think the answer is to continue, by definition. Just by definition, because if something that's alive stops continuing, then it's suddenly not life anymore, and we might as well not talk about it. Then it's dead. Obviously. So what life wants before reproducing, before eating, whatever, is to just stay alive, right? I think we can all empathize with that. And how does it continue? It stores potential. How do you store potential? Well, you need to put it somewhere. That's the meaning of storage, right? It's not stored if it's in the absolute middle of nowhere and you have no control over it. So storage, almost by definition, is an in and an out, right? I've put it in, I have it somewhere, and so I've stored some potential. Which is why I use this image of the circle as a kind of like typical thing. If you look at one of the simplest living beings on this planet, and perhaps one of the most ancient, a cyanobacteria, It's a bacteria that uses chlorophyll to transform sunshine into, well, food for itself, sugar, I guess. And it really looks a lot like that circle I've just shown you. What does it do? It's a circle that protects it and keeps the potential in. Whatever's outside is potentially dangerous, right? There's all kinds of cold and hot things that could eat it or dissolve it or whatever. And then it needs two things. It needs to let resources in, which in this case is mostly sunshine, so it's transparent. And it needs to take the trash out, which is, how life works. There's always some trash in the storage of potential. In fact, you could say this is akin to separating the milk from the tea, right? We're keeping the milk, maybe pushing the tea outside. That would be one way to look at it. But this is, keep that image in mind, and then, so here's the cell, exactly what I've just told you about. Something that is not alive is just spending. Something that's alive is storing, protecting, and spending only when needed. Now let's look at a much more complicated, advanced form of life, a bear, hibernating. This is a mother bear and a cub. What are they doing in here, They're essentially in a little circle, a cave, protecting themselves from the elements, which is, in this case, winter. And winter is something that's trying to take away their potential. It's trying to make them freeze, make them cold, and they found a place to store their potential. And it's not just their body. In this case, it becomes a cave, a shelter. So whether we're talking about the cell or the body or the clothing or the shelter, all of these things are forms of protection for life. And if you look at the den of the bear, actually, when I look at this, I can see a door, walls, and a roof, strong walls, a nice, comfortable bed. This is not an accident, right? The bear has created this in very much the same way that we create a house. I mean, they've got a bed, walls, door, and they've eaten a lot of food. So it's their house. And we could use other examples. We could use the examples of bees or beavers, whatever. I think it's fair to say that most living creatures try to put themselves in a position where they're not going to be wasting potential. So once again, the image I showed you earlier. But if we look at this and we think about the bear den, we could also be looking at this, right? Frankly, what's the difference? This is, it's got the ability to take in stuff, resources, food, and you can take the trash out. It's got toilets, and you can take the trash out, and it will protect you from what's outside, which is potentially dangerous, and keep you safe in. So I want you to consider architecture not as form. Maybe close your eyes, when you think about architecture. It's not about how it looks, whether it looks good, etc. It's about what it does for its occupants. What's its basic function? To keep you warm in winter, to keep you cool in the summer, to keep you fed with a kitchen, clean with a bathroom, rested with a bed, to keep your children safe, or everybody safe, I guess, to keep your belongings safe with walls and locks, and also to keep more intangible things like cultural memories, which help us to remain safe as a society, to feel strong as a society, and to keep us entertained, which is important for us to remain alive as well. And so the basic function of architecture, like clothing, like the wall of the cell, is to keep us alive and well, which you probably already knew, right? But I think there's a lot of architecture that is so much about form, perhaps, or about how it looks, and perhaps we forget how would you want to live in a house that looks amazing but doesn't have a toilet, It's impossible, right? Or a house where it looks fantastic but you cannot cook in it. It's also impossible, unless you get delivery all the time, So looking at other forms of life, this is one of the tallest trees in the world. It's called the President in Sequoia National Park in California. Third largest tree in the world by volume. And this is also another one of the tallest. So why does the tree grow tall like this? You know, it's the same thing as a rock standing up. It's like, it's going in the opposite direction of falling flat on the ground, which is what everything else would do if it was dead, right? It's literally going in the opposite direction of the lowest possible potential. It's going to the highest possible potential in terms of gravity. Why does it do this? Well, in this case, probably this species of tree tries to grow tall to get the sunshine. So it's always about getting as much resources to itself and accumulating. But in many ways, it's reminiscent of the type of architecture we do. And I don't see much difference. The Burj Khalifa, the highest tower in the world, is like a statement. It doesn't need to be that tall, nor does this tree need to be that tall, right? But this is saying, I've got myself such a good protection against the elements that I'm essentially invincible. It's a statement that we're the best, we're the tallest, literally growing out of the clouds, you know, nothing could ever touch it. That's what it's saying, that's the message. It's a statement of power, which is a kind of extension of life, I guess. When you're really alive, you feel powerful. Stonehenge is also a symbol of the alignment with the cosmos, that you've managed to create this thing that lines up with how the sun sets at certain times of the year, and this is also a form of protection. That's why we do it. And ultimately, you could say, well, when you look at tomb architecture, you know, how does this fit in with the notion of protecting life? You know, because the guy is dead, right? But I think when you start to think about it, you realize it's like the ultimate extension of that concept. Because you think, it's as if I said to you, I'm going to build you a house so good, it's not only going to protect you, it's going to bring you back to life, right? It's such a good protection. You're dead, and it will like literally pump life back into you, or protect you until the moment comes when you come back to life. So from a rational perspective, it would have been better for the Egyptians to develop better housing for themselves and sewers, etc. But from a symbolic perspective, they wanted to protect this man god, and they chose this. I'm no expert in Egyptology, but you get my drift. So what are the sources of energy on Earth? Just a bit of a reminder, in case we forget. It's the sun, the Earth-Moon momentum that causes tides and etc. There's the mantle, which is liquid with lava because residual heat, but also because there's nuclear reactions in the center of the Earth, which keep it liquid, and there's nuclear fission, which we use when we take uranium. But for most of the things that are powering life, it's about original storers, which is to say, plants, whatever does photosynthesis, that take it from the original source, which is the sun. And everything else that cannot do photosynthesis is getting it through this process called eating, right? Only these guys are able to get it from the original supplier. And for ourselves and a lot of others, we have no choice but to just grab something from the plant and get it this way. And actually, sometimes it's not just the antelope that's eating the grass, it's the lion that's eating the antelope. And if you continue this cycle, we humans have gone quite far in actually using the next degree. Like, for example, we use animals. We actually use them. So they get their energy from somewhere, and then we use them to get their energy for us. And we also use humans, you know. If you look at the pyramids, whether it was slavery or forced labor or seasonal labor, whatever it is, you essentially have one man who commands to thousands, hundreds of thousands. So that one man is channeling all the energy of these people towards himself. So it's a kind of extreme version of the beaver having an apple. And if you, can we put the first video clip? Thank you. If ever we forget how difficult it is to get something at the top of a hill, or how much we owe animals and all those humans who were under servitude or employment or slavery over the years, maybe this video is a little reminder. This looks like a really tough day at work for those two donkeys. This is it, essentially. The story of life, the story of humanity. It's two extremely heavily laden donkeys pulling stones up a hill, which is the opposite of what the stones want to do. And this brings me to, what is animal power? How much power do you get out of an animal? The one that was most useful for the longest time in many civilizations is the horse. And the horse has, when machines were invented, people were trying to compare it to the horse. So what is one horse power? The horsepower in metric is defined as being able to lift a weight of 75 kilograms 1 meter in 1 second. And that translates as 735 watts. So, okay. Now that you think of it, you're like, well, what's one man power? What's one human power? Well, as it turns out, one human power is about 100 watts. Not instantaneous, but if you said to a man or a woman, but generally because we're talking about, say, just standard hard labor as it used to be defined in camps or for prisoners or whatever, you could expect 8 hours of hard labor, and that would be 8 hours at roughly 100 watt, if it was someone pulling, for instance. But how does this translate into fossil fuels? Something that happens in the 17th and 18th century, probably more the 18th century. Actually, it turns out that 8 hours of hard labor equates to 85 milliliters of gasoline. That's very little, right? I probably have more in this cup. That means if you have 85 liters of petrol in a tank, you have the equivalent of 1,000 men working 8 hours straight non-stop. We're talking about not that big of a volume of liquid here. And here's the difference. Here's why this is such a magical substance. If you tried to get 1,000 men to do something for you, you'd have to feed them, clothe them, discipline them, potentially provide them with affection. You cannot treat people like objects or like machines. They're delicate and complicated. And they cannot release all the energy instantly. It has to be over 8 hours. Whereas 85 liters of gasoline you could literally blow up in 1 second if that's what you wanted. You could release that much energy. Now I want you to understand that before the discovery of fossil fuels as a mean of energy, there was no equivalent to this. There was the burning of wood, granted, but apart from that, there was no equivalent. And burning of wood was complicated because you couldn't burn wood indefinitely. You'd have run out of forests very quickly. I think it's important to remind ourselves, where does this stuff come from? Coal, if ever you have to remember something, coal used to be a forest. And gas and oil used to be fish or whatever in the ocean, right? Zooplankton, not fish, but smaller things. So both of them are the storage of energy, solar energy, over many, many, many years, millions of years, and they transform into these two substances, coal, gas, these three substances, coal, gas, and oil. Now, there was a problem, possibly, say in England, at some point, before the discovery of coal and the usefulness of coal, which is if you're the one who owns the land and you have to choose whether you're going to grow food on it or you're going to grow forests on it. If you grow food, you can feed people. If you grow forests, you can burn the wood and you can build ships or houses, etc. But you couldn't do both over the same square meter, right? You had to make a pretty significant decision. And so a society was kind of a little bit hamstrung or limited, because if they wanted to burn a lot of wood, let's say to melt steel, to create a lot of steel, then that meant they had to cover the place with forests, and then suddenly there was not enough food. And if they wanted to have more food to feed more people, then suddenly they didn't have fuel for their industrial activities. And suddenly there's this thing that actually you can go and get coal underground, right? And on top you still grow food. So you're now, instead of having to choose, you're now layering the two activities, food plus a supply of energy. So the first commercially exploited oil well in North America, possibly in the world, is the Drake well in Pennsylvania, and that's in 1859. Just try to think of that date. That's not a long time ago, right? That's 160 years ago, or more or less, right? How much has the world changed since that guy found oil? You have to remember or understand, at the time, finding oil was actually a bit of a problem. People were usually digging, looking for salt and brine, like things that they could use to salt. Not sure exactly what they were using the salt for, but that's what they were looking for. And then if they found oil, they were like, we found oil. You know, that's awful. We wasted our time digging. It was so easy to find compared to today. You only had to dig like 10 meters and it just burst out of the ground. And they didn't really know what to do with it. Sometimes they just poured it down the river. There were cases of river catching fire, right? Because it was full of gasoline, oil, etc. Quickly they realized it could be purified and it could be very, very useful. But I'm showing you these images for you to understand how easy it was to get oil compared to today at the time. The fields of Baku in today Azerbaijan, I think at the time was part of the Russian Empire, but I'm not sure. At some point they struck oil, such a geyser of oil coming out of the ground. It was 200 meters tall as a fountain. They didn't know how to stop it or capture it. It created a lake of oil. It rained oil for I think a year over a radius of 2 or 3 kilometers. Can you believe that? It's like a tap of oil pouring, and people are like, what are we going to do with this? It's the Nobel brothers, of fame of the Nobel Prize, who made their money with this, by the way, in case you're wondering where the Nobel Prize money comes from, oil. Eventually it caught fire and eventually it was controlled. There was such abundance, though. I think it's important to remember that. That's only 160 years ago. Nowadays, oil exploitation is more complicated. This is an oil platform. You might think, oh, well, it's a typical oil platform. It's in the North Sea. Actually, it's not just a random oil platform. It turns out to be the tallest structure ever moved by humans. It's 472 meters tall. Completely unbelievable images, right, of this thing getting moved around from Norway in 1995. It has 15 times the amount of steel of the Eiffel Tower. And so I'm not saying this to impress you with the amount of steel. That's not the point. The point is to say, why Why are we needing these things? Can you imagine how expensive it is, right? It's because oil is now hard to find, right? It used to be like, oh, you just dig a hole and then you get it. That's over. That's well over. Now we have to go deep. It's complicated. We have to build these extremely advanced, more advanced than our finest, perhaps, buildings, you know. One of the tallest structures in the world. What about this? I don't think people really talk about this thing. What on earth is that, you know? It's the second tallest steel structure in the world. It's completely surreal as an image. You know, no one looks at it in the same way as we look at the Empire State Building or the Burj Khalifa, because it's underwater and no one cares, I guess. But can you imagine the difficulty of creating something like that? I'm showing you these images so you understand the difficulty of getting oil and gas today, because we are running out, right? Oil is increasingly difficult and expensive because it's running out. And we consume each year perhaps the amount of oil that took 1 million years to form. There's no way this thing is renewable, right? So that means if oil formed only over a period of 150 million years, that means at this rate we only had 150 years worth of it, which in the time span of humanity and in the time span of the Earth is a second, right? It's like, think of it like in the future, in 10,000 years, they're going to be like, oh yeah, this is the very short period during which they had oil. And it created this boom and then, well, here's the other problem, which I'm sure you know, perhaps you know intuitively, but it's good to remind ourselves of these figures. How much of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels? With all the effort we've put into renewables, you know? Look at this. This is the renewables. And this is fossil fuels in 2022. So we have a bit of a problem, right? 90% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. It's, you know, we were talking about horses earlier and human labor, you know, by a factor of 1,000 more is coming from fossil fuels. This is the annual coal production up to 2022. It used to be that the UK and the USA together were each producing 40% of the world's coal. And then the UK is now down to 0, if that mine I think in Wales doesn't reopen. And the USA is phasing down. China, however, is like going full in with coal. And then the world, well, it's just rising. Gas, rising also. Oil, also rising, right? And then here you can see the first oil shock and the second oil shock. And then you realize the USA had a peak producing oil on their own land in the 70s, and then it went down. And does anyone know what happened here? Yes?
They started doing fracking.
Yes, fracturing the rock by injecting steam to get more of it. You know, they thought the oil field was no longer exploitable, and then they realized if they just pump some steam underground, at the other end some more oil comes out, and it has created a boom, which is maybe one of the reasons why the economy is doing so well in the US right now. But here's the thing, right? Once again, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get it out of the ground. All that we're doing is essentially scraping the barrel using more and more original ways of scraping the barrel. So it's going all the way up, but it's running out, you know? When you look at the British Petroleum's, BP's statistical review of oil energy, they tell you what are the known reserves of oil, proven reserves. Some of them are exploitable, some of them are more difficult to exploit, depends how much money you have, right? But essentially, this is how much oil there is, this is how much we consume every year, It's very easy. You divide one by the other, we're down to 54 years. Now, 54 years is not a long time. Gas, 49 years. Coal, we've got a bit longer, but coal is very polluting, and it's very difficult to convert it to gasoline, if ever you need to. So, if you had to remember one thing from this lecture today, there is 50 years of oil left in the world with known reserves today. And even if someone didn't believe in climate change or didn't care, even if someone says, I don't care about climate change, I care a lot about climate change, but if let's say someone doesn't care, right? As I'm sure a lot of people can be found in the world, that you can't really be bothered. That's not the point. The reason why you have to stop oil is not because you care about this or that, it's because it's running out, right? So if you don't stop, what are you going to do when the tap just runs dry, right? How are you going to run your society? Especially considering that right now, 90% of society is running on this thing. What is going to happen to that 90% of human activity when we run out? Everything currently, almost everything, is made with fossil fuels. Agriculture is powered by fertilizers, which are made by the petrochemical industry. And this has created an enormous increase of food production, which has essentially ended famine in most parts of the world after the Second World War. We owe oil so much for keeping our bellies full, for our concrete, for our roads, for our dams, for our architecture. Steel requires coal, unless you have these very new ways of producing steel. Brick making is gas-fired. Plastics, we may dislike them, but they're actually very useful, and they have changed many aspects of our life, including in medicine. Heating in the UK is gas, mostly. Electricity in the UK is 50% of the time, 50% of the electricity is gas generated, and transportation. And now imagine, what do we do if we run out? What's going to happen to all of this, right? Are we going to starve? Are we going to have cold showers? It doesn't make any sense, right? So there is, of course, a lot of effort. But I want you to understand the situation that we're in. In order to build the UK's Hinkley Point C, which is the new nuclear station that's under construction right now, with the world's largest crane, an incredible construction site, Europe's biggest construction site, by the way, as of 2019. Look at this image. It's unfathomable. I have no idea what I'm looking at. Can you imagine being the architect in charge of this? It's not an architect, but say the project manager. How do you, if someone loses a truck in there, An incredible achievement. But all of that, helping Britain achieve net zero, all of that is running on gasoline and oil. It's concrete, it's steel, and this enormous steel dome for the reactor. It has not been made with wind power, right? So the point is, in order to go through the transition towards renewables, we need fossil fuels. I'm not advocating it, I'm just stating the obvious, right? Same here. The UK happens to have the world's largest offshore wind farm, great achievement. But to build those wind turbines, to put them up in the sea, etc., you needed some fossil fuels, as it is. And this is a similar one done by the same company off the coast of Denmark. It's very similar to the one that's off the coast of England. And even to transform the electricity grid in this country, you also need oil. You need steel, etc. You need men, women to put up new pylons. It's going to be a lot of work, 58 billion. It's almost as much as HS2. And we need to do that because currently the electricity network in this country is not strong enough to heat the houses with electricity, even if you wanted to. If somebody says, I'm going to take off my gas boiler and I'm going to heat with electricity, well, if everybody decides to do that, the electricity grid is going to blow over because there's too much demand. It's not designed for that. So it has to be upgraded. So we have to conceive of fossil fuels I think, as a honeypot. It's a special moment in the history of this species, humanity. We have stumbled upon a honeypot. Or as do you guys know the expression BOMAD? It's a new expression. It means the bank of mom and dad. People are talking a lot about BOMAD these days because that's the only way people are able to buy a house, right? So mom and dad is the dinosaurs and the forests and the fish, the plankton that have become these things, right? And we've been given this heirloom. It's like somebody gave you £1 billion in inheritance when they died, right? And it is our choice to decide how we spend the inheritance. That's a very, very important question. The question is not, let's stop spending our inheritance. That's not going to happen. The question is, what do you spend it on? If you do something silly, like you have the whole of humanity just takes hot baths and drives SUVs until we run out of oil, then you've blown your inheritance. Right? You have spent all the money your parents left you, and you are now destitute. What that means in this case is that suddenly we go, let's make some solar panels. And then people are like, well, we can't make a solar panel because the glass factory runs on gas. And you see what I mean, right? If we get to this point where we are unable to make renewable power because we've run out of the kickstart we got from the honeypot, then we, as a species, we are screwed. And what's going to happen then is that if we get to this position, there's going to be a lot of sadness and unimaginable things. So the question is, how do you spend it? Do you spend it like you burn it, then it's gone, right? Because it's a finite resource. You say you burn it to make electricity in a gas factory, as it happens right now. Or you invest it in making solar panels, which means that when you've run out, you can turn on the solar panels because you've already got them. And with them, you can make more solar panels, and it's a virtuous cycle. Or maybe in a more kind of like domestic thing, do you spend it on a gas boiler, so you're essentially just burning the gas, or do you invest in an air source heat pump, which is much more efficient, just runs on electricity and can heat your home? This is the dilemma that's facing us, and perhaps the dilemma that you've heard of as architecture students is whether we should, I think it's kind of tangentially related, whether we should demolish things that are still good. You know, there was this big question about Marks and Spencer's in London on Oxford Street, that it's a big building. The developer said, it's full of asbestos, we want to renovate it. I mean, we tried to renovate it, but forget it. You know, too much asbestos in there, too difficult. And then Michael Gove, I think at the time the housing secretary, said, no, you're not going to knock down this big building. You're going to transform it because we've committed to net zero and all those things. We cannot take a huge concrete building and smash it and build it again just because you think it's going to be difficult, you know. And now just recently the High Court reversed Michael Gove's decision, etc. But this is a saga that lasted 2 years, right? So whether they should take it down, reuse it, take it down. And the same thing happens around the same time that Westminster announces that they're now going to become a retrofit-first city. I think you guys have to be aware of this. Like, you see a site, you're now an architect, you see a site, and there's already something on it, maybe a good building, you know, maybe it's got a lot of area. And then I think in architecture school, maybe when I was in architecture school, I don't think that question would have been asked with the same level of passion. Right? You would have said, well, I'm going to knock it down, start again. Nowadays, I think we have to just ask ourselves, can we do that? Is it conceivable to just constantly knock down buildings that could have been renovated? Maybe just because the ego of the architect would like to have a very nice publication in design. You know, look at my curvy roof or whatever it is, right? Maybe it's less sexy to renovate a building, but maybe we need to do it for our survival. So we need to change what we think is cool, and we can do it. I'm sure we can. And this makes me think about. I want to conclude the lecture by telling you about some of the projects that I've worked on over the years, both for other architecture companies and for myself. This reflection on oil running out, on cities becoming retrofit first, has made me think about some of the things I've worked on. This is the Bay of Singapore. At the time in 2007, I was working on the Marina Bay Sands, which is a big casino development that was going to happen here. Maybe not many people remember what it was back then, or remember this view as it used to look in Singapore 17 years ago. This is the merlion, the mix of the mermaid and the lion of Singapore, looking at this site, which had been created, by the way, out of the sea. It's like a reclaimed land, and this is what it looks like now. And it has transformed the city. A huge development, right? I remember looking at this thing and being like, well, it's very famous for its infinity pool now, spanning across the 3 skyscrapers. This is some of the drawings I was doing at the time. I was working on the shopping mall. When I went to Singapore, when the office was kind enough, Moshe Safdie was kind enough to send me to Singapore, I had heard that they were working 24/7, and I wanted to see that. So I went there and I was like, gosh, I wouldn't say it's a total mess because I'm sure it was a well-organized construction site, but the first impression was there's these guys at midnight that are getting rained on with cranes all over the place. It's full of mud. And what we had drawn as a perfectly circular foundation wall, I was like, oh my God, this is it, So don't worry about it. The parts of the project that are visible are well cast, but this was clearly the part that was going underground and that nobody needed to see. An incredible amount of work, an incredible amount of human labor and of embodied energy. And I think as you begin your careers as architects, you're going to be confronted with things like that. Things that are almost completely beyond you as an architectural assistant. More cranes, etc. And this is what it looks like now. So think of the amount of work that goes behind this. Think about the amount of energy that went into it. Let's hope it lasts for a very long time. This brings me to another situation. The first project I worked on at Foster & Partners was the Bloomberg headquarters, the first concrete project that was not a competition. And there was going to be a big new building for Bloomberg, except there was already a building on site. It dated from the 1960s. It had been built because a bomb had fallen, I think a V-2 rocket had fallen on this site in the Second World War, and for 10 to 15 years it had been left vacant as a rubble. And now they built this very modernist bar, office, kind of like chunk of office. And then by the time I become involved in this project, thanks to Foster & Partners in 2010, this is what it looks like. So clearly the place is a little bit run down. It's been squatted. It was an absolute chunk of architecture. It was kind of impenetrable. You couldn't walk across the site. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it was amazing, right? But I remember thinking like, well, okay, so it's not that bad. And some of the people who built it are probably still alive. It's not falling down, right? Clearly, and this is some of the drawings that I did at the time, we were going to create a route through the site. It all made sense from an urban perspective to tear it down. But it kind of made me feel like, well, and this is what it looked like. This is a rendering I did at the time, and then this is what it looks like now. So clearly what we have now is better. This is the way through the site. This is supposed to be, it has been determined as one of the most sustainable office buildings in the world. It won the Sterling Prize in 2017 and 2018. So clearly a good building, right? Very sustainable. But in order to create this very sustainable building, we knocked down this building, which was all concrete. And obviously it looks a bit bashed here. Some of the pictures I took when I visited it, because some people have gone inside and have stripped all of the finishes, and so this is what it looks like. But I kind of felt like this is still a good building. And I felt uncomfortable in this company thinking no one would propose, it seems no one has proposed to the client to keep the original building. I think there's many reasons for that. The urban thing I mentioned to you, the fact that it was blocking urban circulation, etc. It's probably had asbestos, all of those things, but maybe it was still good, Maybe we knocked it down because nobody had the guts to say, this is sustainable. We're keeping it. We're transforming it. The new building has beautiful views to St. Paul. It's an incredible achievement in terms of interior decor. This is the old one. I mean, who would want to keep the old building in that state of mind? But I tell you, if ever one day you're in this situation and you're thinking, we're going to knock down a building that's only 50 years old and it's still good, and some of the people that built it are still here, why are we doing this? Is there nothing we can do with this building? The interior is beautiful. Stone, wood everywhere, fine finishes, leather desks. I'm not sure you'd want to go back to that, Beautiful atrium. If ever you have a friend who works for Bloomberg, I recommend that you ask them to take you in the Bloomberg building. It's very nice to visit. It's just that this is very seductive. It's easy to be seducted by the beauty of the new and to think about the existing and to go, oh, it's too complicated, let's just knock it down. I'm not sure that is tenable. I'm not sure we can continue to do that. So I think we need to think about it. I'll leave you in a final image of all the regal quality of the Bloomberg building. And this is one of the projects that I worked on as myself, as JF Lemay, a transformation. I hear that some of you are working on the transformation of a warehouse. This is a warehouse in Florida, and the client wanted to turn it into art galleries. And this is what it looks like now. I think it's not a project as ambitious as the Bloomberg building or the Marina Bay Sands. Of course, my practice is relatively young. I don't have these kinds of big projects. But I will say to you today, I think that we did a good job transforming a warehouse into something pretty good. And what did we do? We essentially gave it a very good coat of paint. We replastered it. We added a walkway so that wheelchair users can get to the entrances. We created new entrances and we blocked off the old ones. So this is what it looked like before. You had all these big garage doors, not very pretty walkways and rather damaged sidewalk. And this is what it looks like now. So it is possible, as I'm sure you knew. Of course, I'm not telling you that it's possible to renovate a warehouse. It is possible, and I'm proud to have been involved in a project that is about renovation. The trees are new. The project looks rather good at night. Not everything is perfect. Those who saw this project last year in my presentation will remember some of the renderings I had done, which I'll show you in a moment. It's still a lot of work, by the way. They had to cast these H-shaped portals. They cut into the blockwork, cast an H-shaped reinforced concrete portal to support the cantilever, which is made of welded aluminum. The steps are new. The steps are not perfectly formed. There's always a bit of a disconnect between what I showed in the rendering. These renderings done with V-Ray, they always look so happy. Everything looks so perfect. Until the client says to you, and this was the night version, until the client says, we couldn't really afford to do the stainless steel railing, so we went for that instead. But I do raise my hat to the client for having done this project and having tried to do it to the best of their ability with their budget. And I do think that some things came out very well. The canopy, for instance, in Alucobond came out rather well, with very smooth surfaces, very nice curvature. If we look at the interior, this is what it used to look like. It had no natural light. It was brown, strange ceiling, and everything was hanging and abandoned. And this is the rendering that I did of the gallery, one of the galleries, and this is what it looks like now. Once again, maybe not as perfect as I would have liked. We had a bit of an accident, not an accident, but like one of those moments where you think, oh well. The client changed the roof, right? The roof was leaking, they changed the roof. And then they said, but we forgot to put in the insulation, which is now required when you retrofit a building. And they didn't want to change the roof again. So they thought we're going to put the insulation on the ceiling, but because you have all these trusses, you can't like cut rectangles of foam, right? So they thought we're just going to spray the insulation. And this is one of those moments as an architect where you go like, oh, you know, please, don't, but you just have to accept it. You know, I wish the ceilings had looked like this. You just have to accept they're going to look like that. And I think that's the challenge of renovation, by the way. It might not be perfect as a new building, but when you abstract it and you have a dinner in the gallery space, this is Christine Helgaard's gallery in West Palm Beach, her first gallery in Florida, in the US. When you abstract it, you kind of realize, well, maybe it doesn't matter, you know. We just created these beautiful new windows. We brought in the sunlight. We just put up white walls. This is the rendering, and this is the reality, and it's okay. You know, for me, as a young architectural practice, I can say that I'm happy with how it turned out. And to conclude, I want to show you a project which has changed a lot, to conclude on the topic of change, which has changed a lot in the past year. This was a project that was supposed to be, let's say, 300 or 400 square meters, and in a range of 1.7 million Canadian dollars. And the client calls me up last year in April and says, $500,000 hard budget, right? So how do you go from 1.7 million to $500,000? Now, in defense of the client, his initial budget given to me was $500,000. So maybe I got a little bit carried away in the process of designing it. But it was the pandemic, and we were all very enthusiastic about architecture during that time, I guess maybe because of the circumstances. So anyway, it was back to the drawing board. How can we shrink it? And I want to mention to you in passing that the building code in Canada and the building regulations in the UK have caused me to realize that the UK's R values, minimum insulation values for walls, roofs, etc., are higher than in Canada. So clearly someone in the UK government said, let's go all in with insulation, right? A new building in this country has to be better insulated as a minimum than in Quebec, where we have winters that are much harsher. However, this country is in a very difficult position because most of its housing stock has no insulation whatsoever. And those rules do not apply to existing buildings because it'd be impossible to add this level of insulation. Just something you're going to encounter eventually, one day. So in the summer, it's a lot less cold, obviously. It's a beautiful view to the lake. This is the interior. So essentially, we shrank it to being, I wouldn't call it a tiny house, but a house that's essentially one big living space and 2 bedrooms at the back. And we later added a basement with additional bedrooms with a big balcony. And in a later version, here it is with a kitchenette that's very European, very unusual for North America, where you actually have no big fridge. The fridge is going to be under the counter here. You have a Kachelofen, which is a German-Austrian type of thermal mass fireplace, very efficient, and also you can never burn yourself on it. So that's good because the client has a child and maybe one day children, and that's something to think about. And I'm using glue laminated timber that's made in Quebec, but there's some great suppliers of glue lam, as you probably know, in Europe, probably mostly in Austria, around Switzerland, etc., in France. So this is my little attempt at trying to condense all of those things that I've told you earlier. Is it perfect? No. Would it be more sustainable to not build it? Perhaps. But as architects, we have to try to manage. And I'll just leave you with this animation which looks at the exterior of this condensed proposal. So those of you who use Enscape will recognize the visual style. It's maybe not as beautiful as V-Ray, but you certainly get it a lot quicker. Essentially, we have this one living room here, big balcony, and we have a big projection of the roof to shade the interior in the summer. But in the winter, the lower sun, and with the trees having lost their leaves, the winter sun will warm the house. And then we have a number of windows here on the side which will open for ventilation, a bathroom, a bedroom. And it was very important for me that the roof would be accessible. And so you enter the house by walking underneath this bridge. And if you feel like it, you can just go on your roof, which is how you go on the baseball cap extension balcony that protects you from the sun. And here it is from the side. So mostly symmetrical design, just a little house. And this is what you get for the range of about $500,000 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much.